As the years pass and I get older, I enjoy traveling. For me, seeing new places and meeting new people are some of life's greatest pleasures. When my wife and I first got married, traveling was a luxury that we simply could not afford. She worked hourly at a fast food restaurant while I worked hourly at a retail store, and there was barely enough extra to visit family. Somehow, there was always just enough though, and food was always on our table. We did manage to get away 1 or 2 times a year to visit our loved ones. At the time, I sympathized with the prophet as he told his own stories of early marriage, not being able to scrape 2 pennies together, while he and his wife Hope started out in Jeffersonville. I had seen pictures of their little humble shack, and sometimes smiled at the thought of how our tiny apartment seemed like a mansion compared to the house that we heard he started with. With the vacuum cleaner plugged into one outlet, we could vacuum the entire apartment using just the distance allowed by the length of the cord. The little shack in the photographs of the prophet's early home, however, didn't even need the cord. You could almost clean his entire house with the length of the vacuum cleaner hose. Now, after learning about the parties they threw, the vacation resorts they visited, and their traveling around the country, I became curious as to why he said that. I also wondered about the house in the pictures and tried to imagine all those people crammed inside. One newspaper article in particular described an anniversary party thrown for the prophet at their home on Graham Street, which included music, contests, and plenty of guests. The newspaper listed almost 50 familiar names, not including their children or the additional guests they brought with them when they showed up uninvited. This was far more people than I could fit in my tiny apartment, even if people stood in rows, side to side and front to back. The more I researched, the more I realized that things were quite different than we were told. The prophet used to talk about his first wife's death during the 1937 flood. He'd say, "There is where my sorrow started." Learning that Hope Branham died several months after the flood raised many more questions. The prophet told an adventurous story of how he fought the raging floodwaters by boat to get to her hospital, but the waters would have receded long before her death. His gut-wrenching tale described scenes from his journey to visit his wife as she lay dying were simply untrue. He said, "I pulled and it wouldn't start. I pulled again and it wouldn't start. And I tried. I got down in the boat and I said, 'God, it isn't but a few more jumps down here till I would sink beneath those falls there,' where they were roaring and bubbling, miles of water stretching through there. I said, 'I got a sick wife and 2 babies lying there in the hospital.' I said, 'Please, dear God, start this motor.' All I could think, I will never let my girl go out with a bunch of that trash." And I can say, with all due respects to every church, I found out what she called trash is the cream of the crop. I was coming to terms that I could no longer rely on his life story accounts as being historically accurate. Many parts of his descriptions of those accounts no longer made sense to me, and some events simply could never have happened as he described them. Yet it was hard to deny that the death of his wife and daughters would have had an impact on his life. It would have had an impact on any person who endured such a tragedy. That part of his tale I still believed, but I could find no evidence that it had any effect on the young prophet, at least based on the historical timeline for 1936 through 1938. Looking at the newspaper advertisements, not much changed before and after Hope Branham's death. The Billy Branham Pentecostal Tabernacle was still growing. The music program was still thriving. What changed? I knew that the death of his first wife would have been traumatic. I also acknowledged the impact of the traumatic effects of the 1937 flood. It was an experience that would have affected all people that were impacted, especially the poor. But was there a time after becoming a minister when the prophet was truly poor? It was time to start examining the prophet's personal life, and the best place to start was where he told us that his sorrow started. The 1937 flood was truly devastating. Across 11 states, 125,000 people were rendered homeless during the coldest months of winter. In the city of Jeffersonville alone, over 400 families were homeless. The city itself was nearly obliterated from the map. Except for the bridge to Louisville, Jeffersonville was completely cut off from the outside world. Tent cities were set up to keep the homeless alive in the bitter cold. People were being rescued by boat. If the prophet had a boat, there's no doubt he was assisting. Anyone who could help did so to stay alive. There is strength in numbers, and strength meant survival. It was a desperate time, and everyone in the community came together. Some families lost everything. No doubt many families in the prophet's own congregation were homeless and destitute. Even if the prophet was wealthy in his first years as an evangelist, many, if not all of his congregation members, were now extremely poor. Without their weekly tithes coming in, the prophet's income would have also dwindled. While looking through the government records I'd found, I noticed something interesting. As late as 1940, the prophet and his son, Billy Paul, were living with his recently widowed mother on 304 East Maple Street in Jeffersonville, Indiana. Also living with them were 6 of his siblings. I suddenly realized that part of his life story was somewhat true, even if embellished and taken out of historical context. There were several Branhams living together under one single roof, just as he described in his life story accounts. Instead of small children, however, his siblings would have been grown men. I found it interesting to learn that he was working for the Public Service Company at the time. The prophet was a bill collector, collecting money from the poor people in Jeffersonville, while his brother Jesse worked at the dog tracks among the gamblers. I thought to myself, this isn't what the prophet described. I noticed that Henry Branham was among the siblings listed in the home of Ella Branham at the same time as the prophet and his son. Henry was a name that I was recently curious about and had been collecting any information that I could stumble upon that bore his name. When the prophet was first described by the Associated Press in 1948, it was Henry Branham that the news media named as the healer. I had often wondered, why did the press name his brother as the healer? There is no doubt that the prophet went through some hard times. He married Hope Brumbach during the Great Depression. Based on his descriptions of the new automobiles he purchased and the places that he visited, he didn't seem to struggle too much. But those around him would have surely struggled. Still, he had his own set of hardships, and they were such difficult times that no person would have ever wanted to trade places. Not only had the prophet lost his wife, been forced to become a bill collector, lost his house, and been forced to move in with his mother, he did so during the worst of times. Like many Americans, he was faced with fears of war. The United States hadn't yet joined World War II, but many people feared that U.S. involvement in the war was inevitable. Suddenly, I stumbled onto something that was very surprising in the local newspapers. Because of the war with Germany, Henry Branham's name made the news. The 1940 Olympics were scheduled to be held in Tokyo, Japan. In March of 1938, however, Japanese military demanded Olympic venues be built out of wood instead of steel. They needed the material to produce arms for the war that was already raging with China. The Olympic event was moved to Helsinki, but that was also canceled. With global war spreading, the Olympic Games would have been far too dangerous to attend at any location. Local Louisville and Southern Indiana athletes banded together in protest of the cancellation and joined a nationwide amateur athletic union movement against canceling the 1940 Olympics. The Louisville AAU committee received notice that the games had not yet been canceled, which added fuel to the fire. Soon after, Louisville athletes joined New Albany and Jeffersonville. Among them was Henry Branham, the prophet's brother. He was one of 2 bantamweight boxers from Jeffersonville, Indiana. While the prophet was living with his mother, Henry made local headlines and quickly became the center of attention. Walter Corey, pro boxer, claimed that Louisville's best would struggle against Henry. According to the newspapers, Kenny Barrett was the king of the South, and Henry was his able contester. Barrett had made the quarterfinals in Chicago and lost to Jimmy Joyce from Gary, Indiana. Henry fought his way into the inter-city boxing matches at the Louisville Sports Arena. Henry, along with several others, represented Southern Indiana. In July, he was carded to participate in 30 rounds at the Louisville Amateur Boxing Club. While Jeffersonville was slowly rebuilding from the damage left by the flood, Henry would have been seen as a local hero. This made me curious about the Prophet's own claim to be a professional boxer. The Prophet claimed to have won the bantamweight championship for 3 states. In fact, he claimed to have had an opportunity for the world championship and forfeited. Yet when I looked at the old photos of the Prophet, I did not see a boxer. The photographs capture a scrawny man, not a fighter. Nor was I able to find any mention of the Prophet in the news while his brother was making headlines. And a 2-brother championship boxing duo would have made not just local but also national news. Was the Prophet jealous of his brother's success in the championship? He said, "I used to be a boxer. I had the undefeated title of bantamweight championship of the 3 states, and so I know what grip is." He also said, "I was a young fellow and straight in the shoulders, and I'd won the bantamweight championship in the Golden Gloves and went out in professional fighting." Learning that the Prophet was a bill collector for the Public Service Company was surprising at first, but desperate times call for desperate measures. I felt sorry for all of Jeffersonville, not just the Prophet. The real story of what happened, not only to the Prophet, but all of Jeffersonville, was far worse than the life story could have ever captured. I began to wonder why he needed to change the details. The factual history was far more heartbreaking than the story that he described. I was also curious about his temporary change in lifestyle. There was no doubt that the Prophet had plenty of money before the flood, and he may have been poor for a brief time while living with his mother, but his financial struggles did not appear to last very long. The research painted the picture of a quickly restored, wealthy lifestyle, at least compared to the average American during the Depression. I began searching to see how long the Prophet lived with his mother. I found in a 1942 Jeffersonville Evening News article describing the Prophet that he had caught a wolf northwest of Henryville, and the newspaper told his story and described the Prophet. By 1942, he was living at 922 East 8th Street. He had worked for the Public Service Company for years, but for at least 2 months he was no longer a bill collector. He was working as a line patrolman. The interesting part for me, however, was not the wolf caught in a trap. The Prophet was recognized for owning many hunting trophies. By 1942, he was already making big game hunting excursions and was planning on another in October of that same year. How was he paying for these excursions on public service wages? When I thought about the Prophet taking hunting excursions during the Great Depression, a time when most Americans struggled to keep food on the table, in a city where a large percentage of people lost everything to the flood, I became more curious about his role as pastor. A pastor is a shepherd to his flock, a servant to his congregation. I had a difficult time imagining a pastor who was flaunting trophies from excursions in front of the people of Jeffersonville. Jeffersonville was a town where many were still rebuilding from the tragic loss of all their possessions. But I was beginning to realize that this was no ordinary pastor, and he was not ordained as just a minister. How much of his mission aligned with his mentor, Roy E. Davis? It was time to dig even deeper into the early stages of his public ministry.